Opening the center, it immediately fights for central squares and signals intent for an aggressive game. Immediately contesting the center establishes a symmetrical pawn structure, setting the stage for strategic maneuvering. Establishing central influence and preparing for queenside development, while leaving options open for pawn structure. Solidifying the d5 pawn with c6 prepares for pawn structure development, a common theme in queen's pawn openings, aiming for a robust center. Developing the bishop early like this controls key central squares and prepares to castle, aiming for swift development. Developing the bishop to f5 openly challenges the d4 pawn and prepares for the queenside pawn push, though it does expose the square g6. Solidifying central control and preparing for queenside development, this move prepares a robust pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn chain, Black prepares to challenge White's bishop and develop the kingside. Consolidating the bishop's influence along the long diagonal enhances control and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Developing knight reinforces central control and prepares for castling, neatly connecting piece activity. Trading off the bishop on f5 immediately simplifies the position, releasing the central tension and opening lines for White's pieces, while potentially creating a target on the d5 pawn. Capturing the bishop like this creates doubled pawns, potentially weakening Black's kingside pawn structure long-term, though it does open the e-file for future action. Instantly solidifying the pawn structure on the kingside and preparing for a central pawn push, this maneuver simultaneously develops the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses that Black's doubled f-pawns might create down the line. Bringing the knight to e4 creates a dynamic outpost, challenging White's control of the central dark squares and potentially disrupting their piece coordination. This knight now eyes the weak f2 pawn and discourages White from expanding on the kingside. Shifting the queen to this square subtly pressures the queenside while preparing for potential pawn pushes on the flank, a classic example of repositioning for long-term advantage. Unyieldingly, Black anchors the queen to the queenside, creating a dynamic outpost for it on b6 where it both pressures White's pawn structure and offers potential support for a future queenside expansion. Developing the knight to a more active square supports the central pawn and prepares for castling, while also potentially eyeing the e4 outpost if Black retreats their knight. Reinforcing the central d5 pawn and preparing for potential pawn advances, the knight repositions to a more stable square, aiming to participate in the upcoming pawn chains. Clearing the center by exchanging knights grants White an open e-file, but it also offers Black a chance to solidify their central pawn structure and potentially free up their queenside pieces. Consider how this simplifies the board and what new opportunities or weaknesses arise for both sides as the game heads towards a more open middle game. Opening the e-file creates a powerful diagonal for your queen and pawn structure, but be mindful of the doubled pawns that might become a weakness later on. Re-establishing the knight on its original square, the knight now prepares to potentially harass Black's doubled pawns on the kingside and aims to become more active in the center, creating a more harmonious pawn structure for White. Developing the bishop to a square where it influences the center and connects the rook streamlines Black's piece development, preparing for castling and solidifying the pawn structure that has been altered by the earlier exchange on f5. Safeguarding the monarch by tucking it behind a pawn shield now becomes a paramount objective, clearing the deck for subsequent piece development and centralized control. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside so early can be a double-edged sword, potentially overextending and creating weaknesses, but it also aims to disrupt White's harmonious development and perhaps cramp their pieces. Opening the f-file with intent, White confronts the pawn structure and its associated weaknesses, creating a tactical battleground where Black's exposed king might become a focal point. Black aggressively pushes the g-pawn, aiming to dislodge the White king's cover and seize control of the kingside, though it does leave the king with a somewhat compromised pawn structure. A strategic recalibration to control the crucial e4 square and prepare for a kingside advance. Pioneering a bold pawn thrust, Black aggressively pushes the king's flank, seeking to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially create a vital open file or a new target. By capturing on b6, white initiates a trade that will simplify the position, potentially opening the file and offering black a passed pawn on f5, but at the cost of disrupting black's queenside pawn structure and forcing the exchange of queens, thereby steering the game towards an endgame where white's more cohesive pawn formation and central control might prove decisive. Embracing the doubled pawns opens a dynamic, albeit unbalanced, position. Black now commands a majority on the queen side, while white has a slight lead in development and control of the central light squares. The immediate pressure on the queenside pawns requires careful management. Strategically solidifying the pawn structure on the queenside, this repositioning aims to prepare for future activity, potentially on the central files or by supporting a more active knight placement. The bishop, having served its purpose of provoking pawn weaknesses, now seeks a safer, more influential square, anticipating a potential endgame where its mobility will be crucial. Black boldly pushes the f-pawn, forging a new pawn chain and a dynamic queenside pawn majority, aiming to disrupt white's solid structure and potentially open the f-file for future attacking ideas. Opening the f-file, white immediately confronts the pawn chain and seeks to exploit the exposed king position. This bold pawn thrust is a double-edged sword. While it opens lines for white's rooks and queen, it also creates potential weaknesses around white's own king and sacrifices pawn structure solidity for immediate activity. The pawn exchange on e4 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, transforming a closed game into one with more open lines and dynamic potential, especially for white's pieces. An aggressive reaction from white, aiming to shatter black's pawn advances and seize control of the center before black can consolidate their spatial gains. This captures initiates a critical evaluation of piece activity versus structural integrity, forcing black to decide if the material gain is worth the potential positional concessions. Emerging from that doubled pawn and isolated f-pawn structure, black embraces the open f-file with a decisive pawn thrust, initiating a dynamic confrontation and promising active counterplay. Unleashing the rook towards the center, white aims to exploit the weakened king side and potentially target black's isolated d-pawn, injecting immediate dynamism into a position that was becoming somewhat static. Black's pawn thrust on the queen side, b5*, aims to undermine white's control and open avenues for counterplay. This pawn push ignites a fascinating queenside skirmish, potentially straining white's defenses and creating dynamic imbalances. Consider the potential for a queenside expansion where black seeks to gain space and activate latent piece potential. The strategic intent behind b5 is to challenge white's pawn structure and create imbalances on the queenside. This move injects immediate tension, forcing white to evaluate the long-term consequences of this pawn advance. The pawn storm on the queen side begins with **b5**, signaling black's intent to seize initiative. Black's decision to advance the b-pawn disrupts white's harmony and asks pointed questions about piece placement. By playing **b5**, black initiates a battle for queenside real estate, aiming to outmaneuver white's forces. This pawn sacrifice, or at least pawn advance, promises to open lines and generate tactical possibilities. The pawn lever b5* is designed to pry open the queenside and create targets for black's pieces. Solidifying the queenside structure is the primary goal, preventing any immediate black incursions while preparing to develop the kingside pieces and potentially challenge the open files. Reclaiming the f-file with the rook signals an aggressive intent to dismantle white's pawn structure and prepare for a potential onslaught down that critical path. Swapping off the rooks here on the f-file initiates a decisive transition towards an endgame, aiming to simplify white's position and perhaps exploit the newly opened diagonal for the queen. The immediate consequence is the removal of immediate attacking potential from black's rook and the simplification of white's king safety concerns on that flank, even if it does create a passed pawn for black down the road. This maneuver signals a strategic shift, prioritizing clarity and reducing complications over maintaining material balance, a bold choice given the current pawn structure. Repositioning the monarch to the center after the exchange of queens inaugurates a new phase of the game, prioritizing king safety and potential central outpost exploitation by the enemy. Reasserting control over the d4 square and preparing for a potential kingside pawn advance, the knight tucks back, acknowledging the lost tempo but aiming to redeploy efficiently to a more active post, perhaps f3 or g3, to support a central break or defend against black's expanding pawn front. Black aggressively pushes the g-pawn forward, creating a formidable pawn chain and aiming to break open the kingside for his rook, while simultaneously cramping white's pieces. Bolstering the monarch's safety now becomes paramount, as the pawn chain on the kingside has been significantly weakened by black's aggressive pawn advances. This king activation, seeking central influence and eyeing the weakened light squares, dramatically shifts the focus to the monarch's offensive potential and coordination with remaining pieces. The white king now embarks on a journey to a safer pasture, away from the increasingly active black g-pawn and the open files that could be exploited later. Reactivating the king to centralize and defend the pawn chain is a logical step, though it surrenders some initiative and allows white's knight to establish a strong outpost on f1. Attempting to gain queenside space, white's pawn push to b3 aims to dislodge black's bishop from the long diagonal and perhaps prepare a queenside expansion, though it simultaneously weakens the b3 square and the c3 pawn, potentially creating future targets for black's unified rooks. The knight's journey to b6 aims to exploit the weakened queenside pawns and potentially establish a strong outpost, eyeing the d3 square or supporting a central pawn advance later. Recentering the knight to a more centralized and active square offers greater influence over the critical central squares, especially as black's pawn structure on the queenside looks somewhat vulnerable. The black king now strides boldly toward the center, seeking an active role in the unfolding endgame battle, a potentially risky but dynamic decision. Consolidating the bishop's position after the pawn push offers white a more robust defensive structure against black's encroaching pawns. The black king ventures out, initiating a bold march toward the center, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially activate itself for the coming middle game skirmishes. The bishop retreats to a more secure square, anticipating potential advances from black's pawns while keeping an eye on the central squares, preparing to support a future advance of the d-pawn or a knight repositioning. Sensing an opportunity, black brings the bishop to the aggressive a3 square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside after a subsequent exchange or advance. The knight maneuvers to a more central square, aiming to influence the kingside action where black's pawns are advancing aggressively, potentially creating a crucial outposts for white's pieces and preparing to contest the open files that are beginning to emerge. Pushing the bishop to b2 is a tactical repositioning, aiming to exploit the open diagonal that suddenly opens up after white's knight retreats, potentially creating threats against white's king or a future queen maneuver. Shifting the rook to the open file is a sound positional idea, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially exert pressure on black's isolated d-pawn, a target that will become more significant as pieces are exchanged. Shifting the rook from its passive diagonal to the queenside aims to activate it on the open, a file, potentially creating a passed pawn on the queenside with b4 and c5 or supporting the central pawn push. Repositioning the king from the open file offers a crucial reprieve from potential checks while preparing to support the queen's knight and potentially redeploy along the second rank, aiming for a more active role in the unfolding pawn structure battle. The knight's journey to c8 signals a strategic regrouping, aiming to circumvent the strong pawn chain and potentially find better squares on the queenside, perhaps targeting the c3 pawn or supporting a future queenside expansion. The monarch bravely ventures forward, seeking a safer haven amidst the unfolding positional drama, aiming to sidestep the developing threats and perhaps find a quiet corner to regroup. The knight's repositioning here aims to unblock the rook's path and exert pressure on white's queenside pawns, seeking a more active role in the unfolding endgame where pawn structure dictates the tempo. Realigning the monarch to a more secure square is a prudent step, aiming to avoid the lingering threats posed by black's active pieces and to facilitate potential pawn pushes later on. Stepping the king forward aggressively to g5 presents a bold gamble, seeking to use its newfound proximity to disrupt white's pawns and potentially create outpost opportunities for black's remaining pieces, though it does expose it to counterplay along the now open files. Retreating the king to e2 signals a cautious consolidation, aiming to regroup forces after a series of tentative maneuvering, and aiming to avoid further immediate complications in this rather static queenless middle game where neither side has a clear advantage. This maneuver aims to consolidate the king's position while keeping the knight on b6 active, potentially preparing for a b5 advance to gain queenside space and disrupt white's pawn structure. The king's journey back to safety, seeking refuge from the looming g-file threat and the possibility of further pawn advances, underscores the critical importance of king security even in simplified endgames. A pragmatic reshuffling of the pawn structure, aiming to solidify the queenside pawns and prepare for a potential advance on that flank, while also offering a slight improvement in piece mobility. Shifting the monarch back to a more sheltered square prepares for potential pawn advances and offers flexibility against black's encroaching pieces. Breaching the center with a pawn thrust challenges the opponent's control and opens avenues for piece activity, potentially disrupting white's stable structure and creating dynamic imbalances. The king's journey across the board continues, seeking a more secure haven after the previous retreats. The pawn push bravely confronts the central pawn structure, injecting immediate dynamism into what was becoming a rather static position. This aggressive advance opens up new avenues for the black army, particularly by challenging white's control of the d3 square and potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside should white's king be drawn into defending it. It's a bold choice, sacrificing immediate pawn structure integrity for active counterplay and a chance to disrupt the opponent's carefully maintained equilibrium. Opening the b-file, white attempts to introduce some activity along the newly created avenue for the rook, seeking to exploit the potential weakness on the queenside. The structural damage inflicted by white's previous pawn capture has irrevocably opened lines that black immediately seeks to exploit by reclaiming lost territory, creating a volatile pawn structure demanding precise maneuvering from both sides to dictate the ensuing endgame. Prioritizing king safety, the monarch retreats to g1, seeking refuge behind a more robust pawn structure as the central pawn battle concludes. The knight hops towards the central pawn mass, aiming to disrupt white's solid structure and gain influence over key squares like e3. Challenging the knight's occupation of the central queenside territory, this rook advance aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially liberate white's own king from its somewhat passive placement, opening avenues for a more active endgame setup. Seizing the open file with the rook, a bold maneuver, but consider the potential for counterplay if white's king becomes exposed on the weakened queenside.